Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the Einscan scanners and basically how we set them up and do some basic use. The very first thing we're going to do is get power to our scanner and to the table if your scanner comes with one. So the very first thing I'm going to do is take the table and put the power supply to it. Then I'm going to mount my scanner. This is the actual scanner. I'm going to mount my scanner in the bracket for the table. And then I'm going to take the other end of the cable that's plugged into my table and plug it into the back of my scanner here. Next, I'm going to give my scanner and therefore the table power by plugging it into a power strip or outlet and then plugging in to the power supply port. And then the last thing that I need to do to get my scanner installed and up and going is inserting the USB cable into the back of the scanner to the left of the power port. And then the other end of that USB cable then goes into your computer. At this point, I can go ahead and power up my 3D scanner. On the back of the scanner, there is a power button. And the other thing you need to do is download the software, and you can go ahead and launch that at this point as well. It is called Xscan, and there is a link here if you want to visit that to get the download for the scanner software. At this point, you can go ahead and launch that software, and the very first thing it's going to ask you to do is to select the model of scanner you have. So at First Makerspace, we do sell the SE and SP. For this demonstration, I will be using the SE. So in this case, I would select that, but you may have an SP. Common error that happens often at this point in the process is it will say that your device is offline. Your device is probably not offline. It is probably one of three things. You might try closing the software and restarting it. If that does not seem to resolve your issue, you may try powering down the scanner and powering it back on. In my case, I found that it was really picky about which USB port the scanner was plugged into. So simply changing the port that my USB was plugged into resolved my issue. But this is pretty common to have, that it will say the device is offline and you really can't do anything until you get that resolved. Then you're going to have a choice, a texture scan or a non-texture scan. For most applications, you're going to want the non-texture scan. If you would want a texture scan, you might want to be also scanning for color, obviously texture. So it just depends on what you're wanting to do with your file. But let's say you're wanting to 3D print your scan, then you can just go ahead and use the non-texture scan. At this point, up here at the top, it had been about a month since I calibrated this scanner or more, so it was obviously time to calibrate the scanner. So I would suggest best practice is to calibrate the scanner every time you use it. It doesn't take very long, and it's just going to make sure that you have a good, accurate scan. But certainly if it's been a while since you've used your scanner, or if you moved your scanner, you need to do a calibration. Again, it doesn't take that long, just do the calibration. You do need the calibration board that comes with your scanner. It looks like this here. You will want to mount it in the little stand that they provide onto the table, assuming that you have a table you're using. And it's really important. It doesn't do a good job of calling this out, but it's super important. The calibration board needs to be oriented the same way it is on the screen during the calibration process. So you'll see here, my single large white dot is actually near the top of my board. That is important. So make sure that your board is oriented the same way as you're seeing on the screen in the software. Really important. It's going to do a series of three different orientations. You'll notice my large white dot is now pointed to the left of my board. This is the second round. You can see the red on my board is actually the light being reflected back from the scanner. So this is the second of three calibrations, and I will show you the position of the board in the last position, which is the third and final part of the calibration. It looks like this. My large white dot is now pointed down. So again, the orientation of your calibration board is really important. And once you're done, it will tell you that your calibration was successful. If you fail to do this correctly, you will see kind of a mishmash of images because your scanner doesn't know how to orient things. So it is really important, this part of the process. So if you're finding that you're having some issues with your images, like after 2 or 3 scans are just not lining up, it's probably a calibration issue. Go ahead and just recalibrate at that point. After the calibration, it will do a white balance test as well. So you're going to basically just flip that calibration board over, set it right back in the stand. All of this red, again, is the light being reflected back from the scanner. So that is going to do a white balance. It will, I think, shoot red, blue, and green at the board to do the white balance test. And again, it will tell you that it was successful. At this point, we're really ready to set our settings for our scan. And so in this case, I'm using a 3D printed benchy. And if you've done any 3D printing, you've probably printed a 3D benchy at some point. Some settings that I would suggest are, first and foremost, and really important, is the brightness coming off of the scanner onto the object. You'll see my picture on the left here. Not only is my benchy illuminated, so is a lot of background stuff. So cabinets in the background, the block that the model is sitting on. I don't want that. I have too much brightness in this photo on the left. My photo on the right is small and hard to see. However, you can see that only the benchy is illuminated in the picture. You'll notice it's not completely red, and that's totally fine. I'm just needing to make sure I'm getting light back off of my model. Some other settings you're going to want to adjust at this point is, for most scans, you want to turn the HDR toggle to on. And since we are using a turntable, we also need to click that turntable toggle button to on as well. Lastly, it's going to make one complete rotation throughout this scan. What you can adjust is how many times it rotates within that scan. So I think it defaults to 10. That's a pretty good number. You can dial it back down to lower, or you can increase the number of times it will turn, but 10 seems to be a pretty good number. So at this point, we're ready to start our scan, and you do that by clicking what looks like a play button over here on the right side of your screen. And I have gone ahead and taken a video of it doing a scan so that you can see it kind of starts shooting some different lights and shadows at the model. After it does that, it will make its first rotation, and it will redo that exact same process, all the while compiling the data onto the software so you can see what it's doing. So you'll see here, that's that initial image I've got. It's not great. It's only going to get better as it continues to collect data and scan the image. And so that is what that process looks like for the scanning. So again, I have my 3D image showing up over here. Again, it's going to get better. Notice this one says it was 3 out of 10 moves or scans during this process. So that wasn't very many, and it will only get better as it continues that scan. The other thing I would highly suggest is, in this case, I took my 3D benchy and I laid it on its side. That is so that the scanner can now capture the top and the bottom of the object in addition to what it already captured during the first scan. To do this, I just waited for the first set of 10 scans to complete. I set the model on its side, and then I simply hit the play button again. And when you do that, it's going to show you a group 2. And it's going to do the 10 scans again, but this time for the object being on its side, which you can see over here. There's lots of post-processing to enhance your image. So one of the things is called meshing. It's going to take those images and orient them and mesh them. Globalization is another thing I would suggest doing during post-processing. And then a really important one, you'll see I got background noise on this image. That happened when I turned it on its side. It actually picked up the model it was sitting on. I can actually edit these and just delete data. So I can just, outline this and delete the data during the post-processing. So that can all clean up your image and make it better during that process. Next thing it's going to ask you is, do you want a watertight model or a non-watertight model? And it's exactly what it implies. My watertight model, it can hold water. It has no holes. It has no voids. It is sealed. However, the 3D Benchy, it has some open spaces inside. And so I don't necessarily want a watertight model if I'm trying to reproduce what I had. And so I would suggest actually in this scenario using the not watertight model. You can definitely still do some post processing here as well. You can fill in holes that you think should be filled that it didn't maybe necessarily capture when it did its rendering. So it just depends on what you're wanting out of your model and what you're wanting to do with it. But in this case, I had some open spaces in my model and I want those to reflect. So I would not choose watertight in this instant. Here you have to kind of consider, what are you wanting to do with this scan? Do you just want a high resolution scan where you can zoom in and change angles and see things? Or do you want to like perhaps 3D print your scan? And so it just depends on what you're wanting to do with your model. But I bring that up because that's going to determine how you want to save it. So in this case, I would want to 3D print this one. So I would save my scan as an STL file. That happens when you go to save it with the little save icon. It will give you those options down here of how you want to save. Again, kind of have in mind what you want to do with this model, and that will tell you how you want to save your file. So let's talk about some things I could do with that file then. So in my case, I said I wanted to 3D print it, so I saved it as an STL file. I then opened my slicing software, which in this case is FlashPrint, and I loaded my model and I selected my 3D printer, and I could now print this object from the scan. Obviously, I'm printing an object that I already printed. Why would I want to do that? Well, you can modify these object or STL files in other software. So that might be one thing, is you want to modify something that you scanned or previously printed. You might need to repair something or print a very specific part. So it just depends on the application of what you're wanting to do as to how you utilize that file once you save it. In my case, my example is I'm going to 3D print an object. I've seen students model things with clay, and then they can scan that clay model and print it on the 3D printer. You can do engineering, like I said. You can find problems or fix mistakes in designs. All of those things can be done using the 3D scanner. Of course, if you have any questions, reach out to First Makerspace. My name is Megan, and I am certainly happy to help.